couple different ways to crack the nut. Get some. Just right up here.
I'm just trying to figure out what we're solving for.
So
I had the right one.
social cost is flat. So you've got the marginal benefit curve at the start anyway. And you've got this right. That's the slope-intercept form of the line. But that's the marginal benefit curve. So you could
It's not even the marginal cost.
yeah, there you go. And that marginal cost is at 20.
Okay.
And then you can find the efficient level. Really what we're calculating is if the cost is 20, then the median voter is going to end up choosing the open space. Yep, so then set them equal. So to solve for that, I mean, if you did a really careful graph, you could do it that way. But otherwise, set up slope-intercept form. So marginal benefit curve, slope and the intercept, and then set that equal to marginal cost of 20. So marginal benefit here, right?
There at the graph.
That is your marginal benefit is equal to that function. Right? Marginal cost is 20. Set that equal. Solve for A.
Right.
And then you're going to solve that number.
How'd you get it?
So, slope intercept form, right? Basic slope plus. So we've got slope -5. Right? Given that negative half, I should say, times the number of acres. Our x-axis is A, plus our intercept 60. So the marginal benefit curve is that function. Our marginal social cost is fixed at 20. Solve that for A. Marginal benefit equals marginal cost. Okay, so let's see, where are we at on this thing? Looks like you guys got a basic picture here. Okay, so the city will provide 80 acres, and what's the because again? So it's one thing to solve the math, it's another thing to tell the story here.
That's where the social benefit curve.
So we got social cost here.
Social cost equals social benefit.
So who is this person again?
Median voter.
The median voter. Right. So we've got that person being the decider on the size ultimately. So we got 80 units, or 80 acres rather. Now, if the city switches to zoning to provide open space without any compensation to the landowners, so this one's got a little bit more detail to go. So when we saw that zoning map, does the city have to pay to acquire the lands that they deem to be public? I want you to think about that growth area. Remember the red line on the outside? So the city of Ottawa used to be a lot smaller, right? So we got a kind of this 20-year process as we go out. When they pick some areas to develop into, do they have to always pay for it? Not necessarily, right? So that one's kind of open if they're if there's land there that was kind of public land before, maybe it was government-owned land or something, and we're going to leave that open and not sell it to the private sector. So they can maybe come in and zone something, put different restrictions for free. Now, what determines the value of the land? This kind of goes back to our bid rent stuff, and
Yeah,
you know, what determines the value of land?
willingness of people to pay for the rent or whatever.
And what drives that?
Travel costs.
Travel was one thing. What's that? Land quality, right? So when we went back to the acres, it was how much stuff could be done. If we're talking about allowing offices in a particular area, that changes the dynamic compared to a single-family house. Which one's more valuable in the marketplace, allowing a mid-rise building to be built on 1 acre or a single-family house? Which one has more value to the landowner? The offices, right? So if there's more uses to it, we saw how that drives up the bid rent function. And so zoning is a real important thing to land values. And so the guy who was my mentor was a land speculator. He bought farmland and kind of bet that he could get the city to get the type of zoning that would give it enough value. And then also the holding period's the other key thing. If you pay a lot of money and you have to sit on it for 20 years because the city are sticks in the mud, I'm speaking from experience by the way, that they don't want the city to grow that way, right? We drew our red line and the land you just bought up here is outside of that red line. And so come back in another 15 years and we'll talk. Well, you just paid $300,000 for that acreage and now you're sitting on it. And the part of the price you paid was a premium, thinking that you could do something with it. And now the city kind of holds the cards on what you can or can't do. So it's a game that has a decent amount of risk associated with it. Adam?
I heard in Ottawa, Target actually bought some land here.
Oh, really?
And after they bought the land, the city basically told they couldn't build a Target there.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that type of thing goes on. Same, Walmart's fought that battle for the last 40 years too, where they might have tried to do what we call spot zoning too, where like change the zoning immediately so that a Walmart can't be built there. We've always had it in our plan that it was an industrial area or whatever. So yeah, there's lots of games like that. I wouldn't doubt that. There was multiple ones up in Ames because they were pretty anti-growth in general. There was a mall that wanted to go on I-35, and this guy fought the battle for like 10 years trying to get the zoning so that he could get it in, and it would have been within the city, so the city would have gathered all the taxes. It's just that the city didn't want it to be there, and there was also people that thought, well, we're going to take away from downtown area, kind of similar to old downtown where you're going to steal our business away. And so anyway, this thing drug on, and finally the Great Recession kind of ended up wiping out this guy because he had other malls around the nation and ended up bringing them down on some of those. So yeah, it's a real deal that land developers face going in because of these values. Okay, so the question is if in Part C, the city essentially can grab onto land for free, then how much open acres are we going to have according to this graph?
So there's no social cost then?
Yes.
So you just set equal to 0?
It goes to 0, right? So we drop the social cost to 0.
120.
Or if we go back to our rational ignorance concepts with public choice theory, the James Buchanan, by the way, he was the guy who kind of was the forefather of public choice theory. If we have voters that don't really care, don't pay attention to local politics because they don't want to learn about it, so they're rationally ignorant on the issues, then it becomes easier and easier for them to pass these types of things that we should get bigger and bigger. And so we start to see the size of the government expenditures or the size of government-controlled lands in this case or whatever go to a point that's not efficient anymore. And so that is the overbuilding. So in part C, we've got that going on. And how many acres does that end up being here? 120. How'd you get that?
0 equal to function.
Okay, that'd be one way to do it. Yeah, you could shove a 0 into here. And Katie, what'd you do? Just do the slope down 60 over 120 gives you the to follow the negative half slope. So 120 would be the number of acres. All right. Any last questions on that one? The next one's kind of related to it. So flip it over to number 5. I'm sorry, 5 and 6 are related. 5 is not related to this one. This is a little bit different story. Okay, so hey, no cuts. Consider a building permit policy depicted in figure 9.5. Suppose the city announces on January 1st that 300 days later, October 28th, it will give 70 building permits to the first 70 licensed building contractors through the planning office door. The police chief announces the following queuing rules for lining up. No cuts. A person who joins the queue goes to the end of the queue. And number 2, no substitutions. No one can reserve a place in line for anyone else. The price of a permit is the time a recipient spends in the queue. So there's an opportunity cost of time the longer you got to stand in line. There are 4 types of contractors, 25 contractors for each type. So type A, the opportunity cost of being in line is $300 per day. Type B, $500 per day. Type C, $1,000. And finally, there's some contractors that have an opportunity cost of $2,000 per day. So draw a supply and demand curve of the permit market with the price measured as the days spent in the queue. So before we jump into that, I want to talk about this issue a little bit. We're getting into non-market mechanisms, right? So the city has decided that, hey, we don't want more than this amount of new construction going on for whatever purpose they're serving. And so they're limiting the number of building permits. And now we're kind of thinking about the economics behind what the result is, of who gets the permits, who doesn't, and if we're in a different type of allocation mechanism rather than whoever's willing to pay the most gets the good, which is more of the market variety in this case. Okay, so we can use figure 9.5, so let's talk about 9.5 first. So so here's the supply curve in the city if there was a free market. So this is the supply of new houses per year, is what we're measuring on the horizontal axis, and we've got the price of housing. And so we've got contractors that are supplying houses, people that are buying houses. And if we put in a binding quota, right, we saw this in other economic models of just a quota back from international trade or whatever, that we're only going to allow 80 new houses via this mechanism of only allowing 80 permits. What's the impact of that? Well, we get our expected results. The housing price goes up. Houses are more expensive because supply is limited. The new supply curve is actually this kinked supply curve, right? Because there's no more than 80 allowed. And so we've got a $250,000 house. We've got cost for the builder at $160,000. How do you know that? What's our economics background stuff that we have to know from like the appendix and maybe principles class and that sort of stuff? How do you know that the cost here associated with building is $160,000 given what's in print in front of you? Okay, the opportunity cost of building is embodied in the supply curve. The supply curve is the marginal cost curve, right? So the cost of an additional house is embodied in the supply curve. As we move along the supply curve, if the opportunity cost of building a home is increasing, right? The costs are going up at the margin. The 80th house cost $160,000. All right. So now with limited building permits, what are these builders potentially willing to pay to get the permit? $250? It's a little high. What are they willing to pay for the permit?
Oh.
160? So we're not quite tracking here, folks. So the supply curve is the marginal cost of a house, right? Do they need to pay for the permits under a free market system or where there's no quota? No, there's no permit fee. So we haven't talked about a permit fee at all. So the actual material cost of the house is 160. The lumber, the labor, the concrete, the shingles, actually building the house, the marginal cost is 160. Because of the limited supply, consumers are willing to pay 250. Right? For that house, they're willing to pay 250. So, in theory, what's the most that any contractor would ever be willing to pay for a permit if they could buy it, even though they don't have it? 90, right? So this represents a premium above cost. At this cost, economic profit 0. But if they're lucky enough to sell a house, if it's a random lottery system, then they're going to have a bunch of economic profit because of the limited supply allowing the houses to be sold at 250. So they're willing to buy a permit potentially for 90,000. But they still don't have to. They just have to wait in line. And so that's where this problem starts to take effect here, is how much are they willing to pay in terms of the days that they have to spend in line. So for the Type A contractors, they're willing to pay $90,000 because we don't know who's an A and who's a B and who's a C depending on our allocation mechanism, but we know that they're out there. And so they have a $300 per day wait. And so what is their willingness to pay in terms of number of days waiting? 30. Is a little more than 30. We got the $90,000 is the most that they'll pay, divided by 300 equals 300. So that's, now what we've done is we've converted this to what they're asking for. We're going to measure the number of days on the vertical axis. We're going to measure the number of days on the vertical axis. That's the price that they're paying. And the number of houses down here. All right, so that is the direction we're heading with this problem. And we will do these problems, and the rest is, so due on Thursday, work through the Chapter 9 stuff. And then we'll finish up Chapter 9. And Katie, you came in late, but the test for this next section is Tuesday, a week from today.
Are you going to take out the Chapter 9?
Yes.
You're gonna have another review session like the last time.
Yeah, I can do another review session.
Is that Monday or something?
Yeah, probably Monday. Is that when we did it last time? No, because we had it on a different day, yeah. So we'll come up with a time.
We did it Tuesday last time.
Okay.
This was